Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome back to CarmelCast, where we're in episode 34 in our 5th season, where we're focusing on the way of perfection by St. Teresa of Avila. And in today's episode, we'll be covering chapters 32 through 36. But if you didn't read, don't worry. Brother John Mary is going to give us a great summary of those sections. And speaking of Brother John Mary, I'm joined today by him and also, again, by Dr. MaryRuth Hackett. We're so grateful for joining us for this entire season to talk about the way of perfection. Thank you both for being here and for making this a great opportunity for all those who are watching or listening.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, good to be back.
And as always, CarmelCast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. For more information, you can visit our website at www.icspublications.org, where right now we're doing a Lent sale, 30% off all the writings of and about St. Teresa of Avila with the promo code Lent30 at checkout. So be sure to check that out and save during the season of Lent and get all your spiritual reading ready for Easter and summer reading as well. So definitely check that out. If you've never been to our website, I really encourage you to see what ICS has to offer. So as we've been doing throughout the season, we're taking your questions. And today we want to answer a question from Serena, who asks, should I as a Christian be concerned about the prayer life of others? The reason I ask is because most evenings I encourage or maybe coerce my housemate to pray the rosary with me. I guess my intention after listening to the last episode is not focused so much on God and spending time with Him, but instead hoping through praying the rosary to help my friend to develop a prayer life.
That's a great one. I think it's something that anyone who lives with anyone else probably can relate to. And certainly, in my station of life, I've got 4 little kids at home and a spouse. And so there's a balance that you have to achieve if you are in a position of responsibility for someone else, where you are needing to instruct, but also needing to model what good, healthy prayer life is, and then also wanting to be able to evangelize, and then needing, though, still to have that private prayer time and really fully develop that relationship with the Lord, where your eyes are really on your own paper. They're not on anybody else's or what anybody else is doing. You're not judging anybody else's prayer life or lack of prayer life, and because we're all on our own path, right? So we're going in the same direction, hopefully, and our goal is the same thing, but we can get there differently. So I would first, Serena, encourage you to really look at your heart and see what you are primarily responsible for, and that's your relationship with the Lord is your primary responsibility. Because if that is not in a good, healthy, solid place, then nothing else you do in terms of anybody else is going to be anything other than hypocrisy. So you want to make sure that that is first and foremost. And then for any of us who are responsible for someone else and for really helping educate them, then that's a different kind of prayer time where it is instructive. And then I think sometimes we can get so concerned about evangelizing that we can almost become a little sanctimonious. And so I would caution also against that, where the pride kicks in and it's like, well, I'm doing so much more. I think sometimes that can happen in spousal relationships. It's very infrequent when 2 married people are at the same point in their spiritual development. So that, first and foremost, recognize that. And certainly if you're roommates, that's also one of those situations where you're going to be at different points in your spiritual life. And so you might be at the same point at one point, and then a few years later, you're at a different point. And that's okay, because it's all about that relationship that you have with the Lord, right? So be really careful to not come across as being sanctimonious. But be open to the Lord asking you and prompting you to invite others into deeper relationship with them. But from the question, it almost sounds as though it's taking something away from your prayer life. You being concerned about someone else's prayer life in that context, in that time. So I would invite you to maybe just have a conversation with that roommate and say, hey, I love doing the rosary with you. If it's not working for you, I don't want you to feel pressured to do it. Um, but I'm going to do it every day at X amount of time, and I'll keep inviting you if you want to, but I don't want you to feel pressured to do it. That's it's just a great way, because I enjoy sharing that with you. I know during Lent last year I was praying the rosary with a friend every day at 4, and it was easy because for the most part we were in lockdown, right? So we weren't going anywhere anyway. And there came a point in time where it wasn't working for her schedule anymore. They were getting kind of busy, and it was like, hey, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I've missed not doing it with her, and I've missed that accountability that I've had by not doing it with her. But at the same time, like, she's got her own stuff. So whether she does it at a different time or doesn't do it at all, that's up to between she and the Lord. I know it's been harder for me to, do it every day without having her to pray with, though. So, guys, do you have any insight on that or additional stuff to say?
It's interesting because the issue of, she mentions the issue of intention, and she's worried about whether she's focused too much or she's intending too much on evangelizing her housemate as opposed to offering everything up solely to God. And I think that's the great thing about prayer intentions, is that we can unite them very easily to our time of prayer, and God unites our intentions in a time of prayer to His intention for the time of prayer, which is to grow closer to us, or that we grow closer to Him. He couldn't get any closer. He's already very close. So there's that aspect of being able to unite an intention, even if it's regarding somebody else, or even if it's a more specifically a prayer intention that we have. When we go to prayer to do a holy hour or something, and we say to somebody, you're going through this tough time. You know what? Hey, I'll offer my holy hour for you. Well, we don't then spend the entire hour thinking about that person, right? We then go about our normal hour of prayer as we do. But at the same time, that intention is united in that sense. So even when we're inviting someone to pray with us, and we have that intention, that desire for them to grow closer to God, it's kind of like that backpack analogy that I had was it last week or 2 weeks ago, about, we bring all these things to prayer, and then God just takes that backpack, hangs it on the peg, and then we proceed as we normally do. And so it's not this sort of, the intention has to be carried through mentally throughout the entire time of prayer.
Yeah, that's good. The question kind of reminded me of something a little bit tangential, but for me, that idea of like coercion and like really trying to convince someone else to pray, just for me, that was me so much, especially in college. I would always kind of guilt my friends into praying, and I realize now, just it wasn't always prudent, and like to really be careful about discerning that, because you think that you have the best interest of the other in mind, but often you just want for them what you have, and you want them to get there the same way that you did, which is a real danger in the spiritual life. And often in coercion, the person, maybe they'll agree to come or to join you, but in the long run, you're actually doing more harm than good. You can be causing them to have a disdain for the rosary or something like that. And I think this is especially the case you hear with kids. It's like you want to teach them through your example, but at the same time, you can't cross this line of like forcing them too much, or they'll actually grow to dislike it. So it's a hard balance, I think, but that's something definitely to pray about in each relationship. How am I really helping this person grow closer to the Lord?
Well, that's great. So to kind of, we'll get more into some of these issues as we continue, but Brother John Mary is gonna offer us a little run through of this week's reading, chapters 32 to 36.
Yeah. So if you remember last week, St. Teresa started her commentary or her discussion of the Our Father. And so in last week's episode, we talked about, she covered the section of the Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. And now in these chapters, starting in chapter 32, she'll continue on with that discussion. And so she begins in chapter 32 discussing the line, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And she says that this is having already asked for the greatest gift in the spiritual life, thy kingdom come, which is basically for heaven to be here on earth, then we say, well, what does he desire to give us in return? And it's thy will be done. And so what's God's will? Teresa says that it's about abandoning our will to his, and that this abandonment comes with difficulties and trials. It's not an experience of riches and wealth and honor necessarily that God wants to give to us. Rather, he allows us to have trials and persecutions, because this is what Jesus faced on earth. And she says that to those who love him more, then they'll be confronted with even more trials. And so we must learn to give over our wills completely to him and not to take them back. And Teresa acknowledges that it's a lot to give our wills. It's really the hardest thing that we can do, but it's very little compared to the great thing that is gained for us. And so she says that every time we say the Our Father, this is what we're saying. We're saying that we're trying to give over our wills. And it's this giving over of our wills that prepares us for the gift of contemplation, in which we don't do anything on our own, but it's God who works through us. Then in chapter 33 through 35, St. Teresa moves into a really beautiful discussion of the Eucharist. And so she's continuing along her commentary on the Our Father, and she's commenting on, give us this day our daily bread. And this line she immediately connects to the Eucharist. She says that Jesus understands how difficult it is for us to abandon our wills completely to him. So he gives us the strength that we need to do so. He gives us himself in the Eucharist to strengthen us in this spiritual journey. And she just points out what incredible love this is, that the Father gives his Son to lower himself to become in the form of bread and wine, to be misunderstood, to be mistreated, in order to be with us and to strengthen us on that journey. And Teresa continues this discussion in chapter 34, and she asks a very good question. Why do we say, give us this day our daily bread? So we say daily twice. We say, give us this day our daily bread. And she explains that when we say this day, it refers to one day, or the eternal day, in which in the Eucharist, God gives himself to be with us forever. So in the Eucharist, we're already experiencing eternity. We're already experiencing heaven. And so we shouldn't worry too much about the other bread, our daily bread, in the sense of our sustenance, because we can trust that God will take care of that. So especially, she says, during the time of prayer, it shouldn't be our main concern. And Teresa also explains that the Eucharist is a sort of medicine for the body. She speaks about her own experience of being healed through communion, and especially when we receive him in faith and acknowledge his presence, even when we don't feel the consolation. It really serves to heal us and to bring us peace in our bodies. And Teresa explains that receiving communion is not like a picture or a sign that points to Jesus. It's actually Christ present. And so in this, we can't complain about not having seen Christ while he walked on the earth, because we truly see him in his glorified state in the Eucharist. And if we would be unable to handle the glory of that sight if he wasn't disguised in the form of bread and wine. And Teresa really, she insists on this time of prayer. She says specifically the hour after communion, but she says it's a great time for prayer and to really remain with Christ after receiving him in the Eucharist. She says during that time, there's no need for us to look at a picture of Christ, because he already is within us. And so she encourages us not to run off immediately and just completely forget about his presence. And continuing that discussion in chapter 35, she explains that when we can't receive communion, that we can receive a spiritual communion. And through this practice, then we can have Christ present within us, albeit in a slightly different way, but still in a way in which we can recollect and be with him present there. And so she again insists that we don't abandon this practice of spending time in prayer after communion. And she wants us to honor the Blessed Sacrament, since it is so often forgotten and mistreated. And she really laments all the things that she's heard in her time about the Reformation and the mistreatment of the Blessed Sacrament, and she entreats God to make them right. And then finally in chapter 36, Teresa moves on to the next line of the Our Father. forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And she points out that it doesn't say forgive us as we will forgive, but forgive us as we do forgive others. And she says if we've surrendered to his will, then we'll at least have that resolve to forgive others. And once again, in a few of the paragraphs, she returns to this discussion of honor that we talked about so much in the earlier chapters, and about how easily one is offended when they prize honor, when they're concerned about titles or the rules of etiquette. And she said it's not forgiveness to forgive these things, which aren't actually offenses to begin with. And Teresa points out like the centrality of love for one another within this journey. She points out Jesus didn't say forgive us because of our penances or our fasting or prayer, or even because we're willing to give up our lives for God. Jesus says forgive us as we forgive others. That's what's central here. And it's a sign of perfect contemplation when we're willing to forgive no matter what the offense is. And she explains that such a person is not concerned about earthly honor. They find joy in being dishonored, knowing that they're sharing the dishonor that Jesus faced when he was on this earth. And so ultimately, this person, a person who's experienced perfect contemplation, is forgetful of self and completely forgets themselves for the sake of loving God and for loving others.
Great. Yeah, that's a beautiful overview, and lots of fodder for our conversation for today. Dr. MaryRuth, I know you had a question that you wanted to start us with, so go for it.
Yes. So this notion of will, I would love it if you could kind of break down what exactly are we talking about when we talk about God's will in our life, our individual will. The psychologist in me loves to define terms. So if you could help define that, like from a theological standpoint, what exactly is she talking about? And then maybe we can talk about how that applies to real life now.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's very complicated. I mean, it's something that you could write volumes and volumes on. Because we've spoken here about these spiritual faculties, as they're called, the intellect, the memory, and the will, and that these are faculties of our soul, and so they're the means by which we are united to God. And it's these are the faculties that kind of distinguish us from like animals, for example. The fact that we have these spiritual faculties that we're able to turn to God and are able to unite us to God. And part of the reason I think this is so complicated is because throughout history, we've had different ways of viewing these things. And even now, the way that we view things from an anthropological perspective are different than at the time of St. Teresa and at the time of like St. Thomas Aquinas, for example. So he explains in the Summa, he talks about two spiritual faculties, the intellect and the will. And yet then John of the Cross comes along and he follows more of an Augustinian anthropology, and that he talks about three spiritual faculties, intellect, memory, and will. And I think what all this points to for us is that, these are constructs that help us to understand the way that the human person works and how we are united to God. It's not a clear, like set thing. You can't, use a microscope and look into the human person or within the soul and see this. We're one united person, body and soul, and we have these powers within us. And so that's why I think we can look at, like Aquinas, you can separate it out and have two, or with John of the Cross, we can have three, and they're both can be correct in a sense. And then we have for St. Teresa, which makes things even more complicated, that she uses these terms, but not extremely clearly. And often she's kind of confusing the terms. She'll use the word intellect a lot when actually she's talking about like the imagination, which are different things. And so even it's hard to understand what she's talking about there. But yeah, maybe, your question was more concerned, I think, with the idea of the will and what the will is. So I don't know if Pier Giorgio, if you have anything to say about that.
So the one thing that comes to mind, the linguist in me wants to make some distinctions, just like the psychologist and Dr. MaryRuth wants definitions. One of the reasons why this is so difficult, one, because maybe we don't in the 21st century think in these terms. The other is just the English itself, the English translation of these words. So in Latin, from give us thy will be done is the line that Teresa's referring to here in terms of the will. And when we say will in English, we're talking about like how we form the future tense. So I will do my homework, or I will not forget to check my email. I don't know. So there's that complication as well. And the Latin is voluntas, or voluntas, I can't remember. And the word that comes from English there is voluntary. That's where we get voluntary from. So when we volunteer for something, we're intentionally making a sacrifice in order to will it, in order for it to happen. Maybe we have to not do something else in order for us to do this. And so I think that's maybe a better analogy to think of it in terms of that linguistic aspect of to will, to volunteer, or to do something voluntarily. And the purpose, or the motivation behind willing those things is to unite this faculty that's within my soul, that my soul has the power to do, because I'm a human. Your dog can't volunteer to take out the garbage, but we can. Humans can do that, and that's part of what makes us human. That's part of the effects of having a soul, and this being a power of the soul. It's important to see this as a human aspect. And so when we volunteer for something, when we will to pray, we're intending to unite that spiritual faculty to God. And so when we spend time in prayer, whether it's the will or the intellect or the memory, we're uniting those aspects of the things that we can do as humans to God for this time in prayer.
Yeah. When we talk about like what does that look like? What is that experience? What's the phenomenological experience of like being in prayer?
Those are big words.
Yeah. I think we know, like, if you spend a time in prayer and you're distracted, but yet you were choosing to be with the Lord during that time, but you didn't have the ability if you were tired or distracted. I think when we reflect about our prayer, we can see the difference between that and when I go to prayer and I'm choosing other than to be with the Lord. I'm choosing to be distracted. Maybe that takes some careful analysis of our time of prayer, but I think we can see then how it is that our wills can be united to the Lord, even if our intellects are still wandering about or our imaginations are going wild, because there's still this like desire. And like you said, volunteer, there's a choice, and you're making a choice to love. And that's really the power of what the will can do, is it chooses to love. And so I think when we, at least that's the best way I think I can experience it in my own life, is there's times when I've gone to prayer and I've actively chosen perhaps not to give myself to that time. And there's times that I have chosen to give myself, and yet maybe the result was the same. I was distracted, but my will was still there. I desired to be there for the Lord.
So could you, I know we talked about, voluntary as being one of those. Could you also say like intent, or intentionality, or that internal desire of the heart, right, to do something? And I think sometimes when we talk about our own will, it's that intent or that internal drive or desire for something other than what the Lord wants. And so we're trying to really look at that intent or that desire that we have of our heart and say, is this of God? Is this out of our love of God? Is this something that the Lord wants for me because it is going to help me to grow in spiritual union with Him in some way, shape, or form? I'm thinking of, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of surrendering our will to God. So like trying to do that in in the big things and the little things. So I was in prayer the other morning. Well, first of all, does that make sense? Before I go on my little digression, is that accurate? Am I?
Yeah, I guess the only distinction I would make is that, yeah, we have to distinguish that desire from more like base desire, in the
Right.
sense of like what I desire on the level of like my emotions or something like that. So I have a desire for a piece of chocolate cake, and that could be a desire of my will, but that runs through this whole process of my intellect discerning, is this the good? And so, like, Aquinas defines the will as the appetite of intellect. And that's kind of complicated terminology, but he's basically saying it's a yeah, it's we our wills naturally desire the good, and it's us discerning whether this thing or this choice that I'm going to make is the good that's going to bring me to my ultimate end, which is happiness or beatitude.
Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Um, so I was going to go on a little digression. I'm still going to go on the digression. Because it's we're studying Saint Teresa. She was the master or the mistress of digression, I think. So I was in prayer the other day, and I realized as I'm praying that my son was not awake yet, and he had an 8 a.m. game, and it was like 45 minutes away. And thinking of when my prayer time usually was, I was like, oh, he like I should be hearing the garage door open pretty soon, and I'm not. So I'm feeling sort of distracted. So I bring myself back to prayer. I was like, okay, I'm not worrying about this. This is not my deal. This is his deal. He's an adult. If he misses his game, he misses his game. And then I'm I'm finding my heart moved to be like, but this is your vocation. Like he's still in your home and he's still your responsibility. And so I had to just bring that into prayer, into that. Because initially I was like, okay, I'm dismissing this, like I've got this distraction. And I was like, wait a minute. So Lord, is it your will that I break my prayer time with you? I mean, heaven forbid, and go wake up this kid that should have woken himself up? And I did. I was like, okay, well, I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. And I did, and it was a good thing, and it brought he and I closer together, and we had some great conversations about responsibility and like all in all, and I was able to hop right back into my prayer time, and it was all good. But I think sometimes like my will was to stay in prayer with the Lord. Like that's what I wanted to do. That was what I was feeling sort of irritated that I was going to have to get out of bed and go down and maybe get yelled at by my son because, Mom, I decided not to go to the game or whatever it was going to be, right? But I couldn't. Like I had to just stop and say, Lord, what is your intent for me right now? Like how do you want me living out this time? So I bring that all up because we can think of God's will in like these big, huge, majestic terms. It's his will that I get married. It's his will that I take this job. It's his will that I profess holy orders, like whatever these big, huge things are. But really, if we're talking about living our life surrendered to the Lord, it's the little things too. And sometimes it's mostly the little things because it's all those little things and those little conversations that we have with the Lord, those little practices of saying, oh, okay, I feel kind of calling me to do this. Oh, I feel like maybe this, and I'm saying feel, and I know emotion is not supposed to be a part of that. So you can call me on that later if you want. But where we have a movement of our heart in a certain direction, and it doesn't have to be the big things. And I think sometimes we get caught up in thinking that it's all like these huge big things, when in reality it's 100 little things throughout the day where we're trying to align ourselves to what God wants for our life. Was the digression worth it?
Yeah. And I would say it's more than the 100 little things. It's really the million little things. It's every moment aligning our wills to God's will. And we can be perhaps too like freaked out by that, and we don't want to be like get so wrapped up in that. But that's what the work of prayer is supposed to be doing in us, is aligning our will to God's will so that we can constantly make these decisions about everything. The way that I talk to everyone, what words I say, how I act can be united to what God wills for my life.
I think that's one of those. Go ahead.
was just saying, I feel like sometimes we picture God as sort of like this big picture person. That's, it's an analogy, but at the same time, what does Scripture tell us? He knows the number of every hair on our head. And I'm having few of those these days. They're falling out as I get older. But he still knows how many there are. So he is that big picture person, but he couldn't be more into the details. And this is what love is. This is what love is that he loves us so much that he knows every intimate little detail of our lives.
And I think what St. Teresa is saying, would be easy if it were only the big things. It's like, oh, I only have to find out what God's will is for my vocation, and then that's it. Then I'm good to go. But then the reality is, she's saying, no, we have to learn in every little choice we make in our lives to do what's going to bring us closest to him, to love him, to love others. And that's really what it means to give over our wills. And that's why she says it's really the hardest thing that we can do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's the hardest thing that we do over and over and over and over again, not just one time,
Right.
but repeatedly and consistently. And I think that's one of the other side of that coin is then like looking at how we embrace those struggles or those trials when they come up naturally. Because if we are constantly, consistently evaluating his will in each of the situations, then it can really help us to embrace the trials that come our way, because ultimately we know that he wants us to grow in virtue, right? And he wants us to grow closer to him. So if we can look at those trials as a way to grow in virtue. My daughter actually told me last night that she hates it when I do this, because she came in to complain about the other daughter. And just ridiculous sibling bickering. They share a room, and it's like disastrous right now at this point in their life. And I told her about how much further ahead in life she's going to be, because she has a sister who helps her practice all of these virtues on a regular basis, and that like, wow, she gets to practice patience like so often, yada yada yada. But if we can see the virtue that can come out of all of these, then I think ultimately, like, that's the way to really learn to embrace the trials that come our way. And I think it's in James, letter to James, when he says, consider it joy to have these sufferings. That's how we grow in humility. That's how we grow in awareness. That's how we can really see our own perfections and the things that we need to continue to work on, especially when we're injured by others. And like she said, it's that daily Eucharist that gives us the fortitude to get through all of those struggles. But yeah, embracing those troubles, that's hard to do, to embrace the trials.
Yeah, I think the word that you use there that's so helpful is for our growth. It's for our good.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, even reading it this time, these chapters this time, it seems almost like it's very difficult what Teresa's saying, because she's saying, well, if God loves us, the more he loves us, the more trials he's going to give us. And it's like, what kind of God is this that he wants to give me trials? But the reality is, it's helped me to view it like a parent almost. It's like, no, he wants me to grow. And the way that I can grow is by him challenging me. It's like, any parent who sees their child, straying, they're going to challenge them. And at times you're going to rub them the wrong way. And your 9-year-old daughter's going to tell you how terrible you are.
Right.
But it's because you
that
love
was
her.
Today.
It's because that you love her, that you're pushing back and challenging her. And so God sees those who love him the most. He sees there's the most potential here. And so I can shape you and form you because I love you. So these challenges are then opportunities to grow closer to him.
I think another analogy that's helpful is for any of you listeners who are athletes, because it's like a good coach is going to push you, and he's going to push you, and he's going to push you, and sometimes he's going to push you until you're like over on the sidelines throwing up. But like, that's how you get better. You don't get better by sitting in your comfort zone and just running your easy little lap. Like, that's not how you're going to get better. You're not going to grow. Your muscles are not going to break down and have to rebuild, which is what happens when you build muscles. So I love the athlete analogy, but we've got a bunch of athlete athletic kids, so it
Yeah.
works for our family.
Yeah, so I mean, this just great discussion in covering every aspect from uniting our wills to God. What does that mean, and also what happens when it's God's will for us to go through trials and suffering. So we've kind of got that aspect of Saint Teresa's meditation on the Our Father covered in terms of the will and His will be done in our lives. I definitely want to spend a lot of time towards the end talking about the daily bread and the Eucharist and Eucharistic spirituality, a la Saint Teresa of Avila. But I think coming from this discussion on wills, we all of us have different wills. When we come into contact with each other, we can clash a little bit, and so I think it would be good to jump a little bit to the forgiveness aspect. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, because I think it really goes right next to and along with this idea of God's will for our life. So one question that came up that we've kind of been putting off, and I think it really fits well into this discussion of forgiveness and also humility. And it's Saint Teresa, so humility is everywhere. Throughout the entire book, it's going to keep coming back. Humility and determination, charity, all of those things will come up again and again. But with respect to humility and forgiveness, I think a lot of this stems from our pride and that constant struggle that we have to keep our pride in check. And Saint Teresa talks about this at length towards the end of the readings that we covered today, in terms of those little honors that we like to set up for ourselves and collect like little medals on our cork board in our teenager
Teenage room.
room, and trophies and things like that, and how these things really aren't what God is concerned about in terms of His will. So pride, forgiveness, and His will. How can we connect some of these things together? And so the question that we had was, could you speak about ways to catch ourselves before we were even getting to pride, but to catch ourselves from becoming prideful in those moments? And the person asking this question says it's something so hard to notice, and yet it ends up damaging so much of our relationships with others and especially with God.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer, I think. And especially trying to think of like tying it into what Saint Teresa has said here about forgiving others. And really, I think it connects back to this idea of abandoning ourselves to God's will. I've just found for myself that rather than being concerned always about trying to like catch myself, if I'm less on the defensive and more on the offensive, I think that's helpful for me. If I'm just constantly pouring myself out for the sake of my brothers and sisters in the world and for the sake of God, there's no time to be prideful, because I'm constantly focused on giving of myself. And I think that is helpful for me. I mean, you still fall into pride at times, and then perhaps after the fact, in a time of, when you're doing an examination of conscience at the end of the day, you can catch those times. But yeah, I think rather than being so like focused on yourself, the answer to pride is always to be focused outward on others and on God, and really just loving them. And that this, ties together with this idea, Teresa's idea of forgiveness. It reminds me of First John, in First John, where he says, how can we say that we love God who's in heaven, who we have not seen, when we don't love our brothers and sisters who we have seen? And how that's really the testament of our love for God is the way that we love others.
Yeah, I like the orientation of focusing less on trying to avoid the sin and instead practicing that notion of like positive holiness, where you're really striving to grow in virtue. So if you notice that you have a tendency to be prideful, then rather than trying to like find those little areas where you might be stepping into pride, um, praying every day and asking the Lord to humble you. Just every day, Lord, help me to grow in humility and love of my neighbor. Like just so focusing on that that opposite thing. We do that a lot in parenting, and parenting is my kind of wheelhouse. And when you see a child who's really suffering, um, or who's really not suffering so much as they're struggling to grow in an area, and they're struggling with a particular sin, is finding that converse, finding that virtue, and being intentional about helping to nurture that virtue within that child. So it goes to the same, right? If we're finding ourselves struggling in one area, then saying, okay, Lord, help me to grow, in because all the sins have, you know, complementary virtues.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think too that John Mary, you were saying just about not focusing so much in the moment of avoiding it, but it's so important, the idea of an examen or examination of conscience at the end of the day. And when we ask for forgiveness in those moments for the times when we failed, then over time this is gonna build resistance, right? We're gonna gain sort of resistance to our predominant and habitual sins, and pride is so much of a habit, especially in the 21st century, where we have trophies and things like that. I want to, going back to chapter 32, I want to read this little section because it's pure gold. Teresa says, this is chapter 32, paragraph 6. Well, I want to advise you and remind you what his will is. Don't fear that it means he will give you riches or delights or honors or all these earthly things. His love for you is not that small, and he esteems highly what you give him. So this idea that he doesn't love us small enough to give us things like riches and honor and delights. He loves us more than that, more than these things, and sort of it puts into perspective where sort of these things that we become prideful of fall into the grand scheme of what God wants for us.
Yeah. And that's what's so hard about, pride to begin with, and the sin of pride is almost in the trying to examine ourselves and catch ourselves in that. There's a hint of pride in that very act, by thinking like, I can stop this, or I have complete control over this. When in reality, that's contrary to abandoning ourselves to God. And so it's almost, in the act of trying to catch ourselves, we can be committing an act of pride. When in reality, like you said, Pier Giorgio, God loves us more than that. He wants to be the one, to come into our lives and transform us.
Yeah, that's so huge. Thank you for bringing that up.
I want to pick up on something else that you said, and you both mentioned about that importance of doing that examine every night, that examination of conscience, where you're really able to look at what you've done and what you failed to do throughout the day. And when we do that, when we go through that on a regular basis, and we're able to realize our own imperfections, that's going to help us so much to be more accepting of others' human failure. And our recipe for reconciliation really gives us the perfect opportunity for forgiveness and reconciliation with others, which is so important for us, and for living in community and living in relationship with one another, but also for our sanctification. So just I think we're so lucky, so blessed. My husband and I have talked about it a lot, how when we are able to see our own faults, we stop expecting other people to be perfect, and we almost come to expect them to have faults. And when it comes up, there's this almost relief that we're all human. Like, okay, phew. I tell my husband I love it when he messes up, because then I feel better about when I mess up, because I mess up a lot more than he does. And that's just the reality of living in community with one another. So yes, we can say that maybe we can say, oh well, thinking about it, our faults too much is a bad thing. Of course, we've got to have balance. but it is going to help us to be better at accepting the faults of others if we're not expecting perfection out of ourselves.
Yeah. And that reminds me also of what we said earlier about it's the 100 or million little choices throughout the day. That's what we're examining, because I think there's a danger in the spiritual life right now. People, when they examine their conscience, they're looking for like these big sins, the ones that you go confess to the priest. It's like, oh, well, I lied this many times, or you know what I mean? And so when you examine your day, it's like, okay, I didn't do any of those things, check. When in the reality, and this is, a special practice, I think, for religious, but something that was life-changing for me was to begin doing an examen twice a day, to do it in the middle of the day, because I find by the end of the day, it's hard to remember the whole day. So when you have a break in the middle of the day to make this time, because then it's like, no, I can go through every moment of my day and think through it and think, what was God's will for me, and how did I respond to that will in that moment, in both the good and the bad ways, and to really see then, because if I'm just looking for the big faults, then maybe I can use 5 seconds and I'm not going to find anything, or maybe I will, but it's not going to be helpful for really, really, like you said, growing in humility and seeing my shortcomings, but also these as opportunities that God He's giving me these trials to help me to grow.
Yeah, and if anybody is struggling to really understand or align their will to God, doing that twice a day is definitely going to help.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be long either. We have to get to the Eucharist.
All right.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to direct our attention there to give us this day our daily bread. And these 2 chapters from today's reading on the importance, what happens in the Eucharist, what and how it displays God's humility himself, and then also this idea of prayer in the context of Mass, and St. Teresa's very helpful suggestion of prayer after Mass, whether or not you've received communion or not. So where should we go first? I guess we'll start with what's happening in the Eucharist, and what does Teresa bring our attention to in these chapters?
Yeah, Teresa has such a strong focus on the real presence of Jesus Christ and his glorified body in the Eucharist. And I think that unfortunately it's something that's either forgotten or not believed today, or overlooked. And I think it's just so important that we can get back to that, realize what a grace this is, that God is coming to us, not just to be there in the tabernacle even, but to become one with us in our consuming the Eucharist. And just what an incredible grace that is that's a big prayer of mine, that we can return to this honor and awe at the Holy Eucharist.
Yeah, and doing preparation to prepare our hearts to be able to receive him, in his great humility, and our participation, the importance of our participation in this great act of the Church, in this representation of his sacrifice on Calvary, and also the communal aspect of it as well. This sharing, this ecclesial sharing of becoming one body in Christ.
Yeah.
So from this great reality that occurs in the Eucharist and at Mass, and particularly the sacramental unification of ourselves to Jesus in the Eucharist when we receive him in communion, whether it be sacramental communion or when we make a spiritual communion and we intend that act of spiritually uniting ourselves to God, the importance then of making use of that reality, and not running out to the car to be the first one out of the parking lot, or so that we can get home and turn the oven on or something like that. take some time. And so, knowing that we live in an imperfect world, and that so many people that I know who come to Mass here, for instance, at our shrine, in the morning, they got to go to work, and so, what would be some suggestions that you guys would have to people who maybe are going to Mass with their families, and the difficulties there, and trying to corral your kids to Mass in the first place, but then to make an act of spiritual thanksgiving when everyone's piling out of the church, right? But also those who they want to make Mass a priority in their lives, whether it's daily Mass or, of course, Mass on Sundays. What are some helpful tips to conceptualize the importance of this, and why do you think it's important?
So I have to give full disclosure that we're really horrible about this. And when we started, we just are. When we started going back to Mass after the shutdowns, there was a lot of anxiety with some of my kids about being there, being in a big group. The pews are every other pew, but it was still really disconcerting to them to be around people. Our parish does not require masks to be worn. So sometimes we went to another parish where they'd be more comfortable. And the agreement that we came to was that they would need to come back to the pew and say a prayer, but that we were going to leave then because we didn't want to get caught up in the crush at the door and all those people. Now, a better solution, which I fully admit, you guys are seeing all my imperfections right now, or some of them very clearly. A better solution would have been, we're going to stay after Mass, and we're going to kneel, and we're going to spend 5 minutes in prayer after Mass. We used to do that, but it was usually a punishment for the kids who misbehaved during Mass. They then had to give their time after Mass when they were really little. They're really good in the pews now, though, so they think that they can leave right after Mass. But if you have kids and you have a family, make it part of your regular routine to, after you receive the final blessing, to then kneel again and spend some time. Because if it's part of your normal family routine, you let the rest of the church clear out, silence comes down, and then you can go outside once mom and dad are done. So that, I think, habit is the biggest thing, is just making it a part of the habit, and then you're able to convey to your kids why it's so important that you're doing that. And then I've got something else about the daily Mass thing, but do you guys want to go? Do you have anything, John, Mary?
Yeah, I just want to say, part of the genius of Teresa's teaching is that we can find and we can bring Christ with us anywhere. And so, like we said, our imperfect realities, or like when you have to leave Mass early, perhaps. Or even, I think there's a discernment, like it's good example to kneel down and spend some time in prayer, but also there's a give and take of like, well, I'm also then missing this time of fellowship, which is also important in church. So like balancing that with my need for prayer as well. But the genius of Teresa's teaching is I can bring Christ with me and be present to him in the midst of, walking out to the car, greeting people at the after Mass, or being in the car driving with my family back. So it's like just this presence for the hour after I've received communion, no matter what I'm doing, even if I'm running off to work, that Christ is within me and is present with me. And again, ideally we'd actually have time for a more formal prayer, but when that doesn't happen, know that we can still be aware of Christ's presence in that way.
Yeah, so just to wrap up our episode this week, this is a really great discussion, and I know that we've been doing this thought to take home. There's lots to take home this week, but Dr. MaryRuth, we've been turning to you for your motherly wisdom in these at the end of the episode. Can you give us some thoughts to take home this week?
Yeah, so I've got to, you guys know I love like the multiple choice. Choose your own adventure here with the take home points or your call to action. So 3 questions. What aspects of your life do you need to change? in order to live a life of greater integrity or wholeness as you're surrendering your will to his. So just think about the various aspects of your life and what do you need to change in order to be able to more fully surrender his will to him. And then this is like a sub question. Are there areas in your life that you're holding back from the Lord? So for those of us who say like, oh yeah, no, I've really surrendered everything to the Lord. I'm really good about doing that. I do that on a regular basis. Sometimes we take one little area of our life and we kind of wall that off. And we say, well, I'm not going to surrender this part to him. And we do it without even realizing that we're doing it. But maybe it's friendships, or maybe it's a struggle with a family member, or maybe it's a certain aspect of your marriage. Maybe it's a work issue. But sometimes, very frequently, there's one area in our life where we're not surrendering it. We're not holding, we're kind of keeping that to ourselves. So examine that. And then the third question is, what is the Lord asking you to endure now, to suffer through, in order to grow? Because sometimes if we can recognize that area of suffering as a gift from the Lord in order to help us to grow, that is really what we need.
Very, very helpful, I think, questions to consider for this week. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Just want to remind all of our listeners and viewers to please leave comments if you're watching on YouTube, or send us an email at CarmelCast@icspublications.org with any questions that you may have. We only have one episode left. Can you believe it? So be sure to submit those questions so that we can take a look at them for our final episode. And speaking of our final episode, next week we'll be covering the very last chapters of The Way of Perfection, chapters 37 to 42. We want to thank you for joining us this week and for joining us in reading this book together. It's been so much fun, and we look forward to wrapping up next week. So God bless you. Hey everyone, Brother Pier Giorgio here. Thanks for checking out this episode of CarmelCast. If you want to hear more of us, don't forget to click subscribe. Also, be sure to click like if you enjoyed this episode, and maybe even leave us a comment. We post discussion questions down below to get the conversation going. Want more information on Carmelite spirituality and the Discalced Carmelite saints? Then you'll want to check out our website, www.icspublications.org. There's a link in the description of this episode. From here, you can see all our current promotions and access our complete catalog for the writings of St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Therese of Lisieux, St. Elizabeth of the Trinity, and St. Edith Stein. If you want to stay up to date on all our promotions and new titles, then be sure to add your email to our email list. There's no better way to stay up to date on the latest Carmelite publications. Thanks for joining us, and may God bless you.